Assalamu alaikum, bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Hope you guys are doing well. Happy Saturday. Again, my apologies to the interactive group because I had serious fasting brain and I forgot to let everyone know there that we were starting an hour late. So I'm so sorry. And thank you for being so patient with us. And we're just really excited that you're all here. First I wanted to start with a little bit of good news on the Adopt a Surah front. Yesterday I got an email that someone is adopting Surah Al-Fatiha for $10,000, alhamdulillah. So I wanted to just ask everyone to make dua and pray because it's just really amazing and lovely. And you know, especially I think this Ramadan, people are noticing a drop in fundraising across the board. I'm not really sure, you know, if people are having, you know, a lot of financial difficulty or anything like that. But so, you know, I'm so grateful when people come forward and support what we're doing. I mean, obviously, I really passionately believe that this is the hope for the future, understanding the Quran in a way that is really relevant for our life and our times. And I don't know that I mean, there's nothing else out there that is as exciting and hopeful and inspirational and challenging. So I'm just extremely grateful when people show their support, you know, with everything from a $5 donation to, you know, a $10,000 donation. So thank you so, so much. I thought very quickly, you know, as we've been unpacking the library, we've been just discovering just amazing things that were probably lost for decades. But this was not one of them. But I wanted to give a little bit of book history today, which I thought was kind of fun. This is like an orange little copy. It's called The Authoritative and the Authoritarian. A little treatise and pamphlet, which started out, this was published way back in the 90s, and it was a little case study of a fatwa of a basketball player named Abdul Rauf, who refused to stand up for the national anthem. And it became a thing in Muslim circles because everyone and their brother was coming out and pulling hadith here and pulling hadith there, and, you know, people arguing why it was halal or haram for him to do that. And so at that time, the professor decided to write just a really short treatise on using that case study to demonstrate Sharia in action, and that, you know, you can't just like pick and choose individual hadith here and there and use that as a basis for a legal ruling. And so he took that case and demonstrated how, you know, actually it should work. And it was a fabulous little book. And what's interesting is this expression, authoritative and authoritarian, became sort of like a catchphrase. Like before this book came out, no one would refer to things as authoritative or authoritarian. But as soon as this book came out and it started to circulate, everyone then started using these terms like, okay, how do you know what's authoritative versus authoritarian, which is sort of interesting. So this book was published at the Islamic Center of Southern California, interestingly, through their, they had like a publishing arm called MVI, where they would also publish the Minaret magazine, which is where a lot of the chapters from the Conference of the Books were originally published before they were collected into this volume, which is The Search for Beauty, Conference of the Books, an amazing book. And I just want to plug it. This is like, really, it's an incredible book because it takes you, through real life stories, through a journey through our tradition, and learning about jurists in you know, previous times and places. The premise of the book, it's actually based on this library here. So the Conference of the Books is the idea that people would write to the sheikh, asking questions about everything under the sun with regard to Muslim life in America. And he would then retreat into this library in the evening and have these conversations with jurists from the past, and the jurists would be represented in these books. So it's like a conference of the books, a conference with jurists. And the premise would be, you know, God is beautiful and God loves beauty, and what would be the most beautiful moral way to solve whatever problem was at hand at that particular time of the night. And so he got all kinds of questions, you know, about everything from marriage, divorce, you know, dealing with your parents, obedience versus respect, things that were more popular like terrorism, just, you know, basically everything that touched upon life in America as a Muslim, struggling to find your faith, struggling to, you know, find your way. And so this is written in chapters which are individual short stories, and it's beautiful. This book, as I've said many times, has brought people back to the faith. Like we get these amazing letters and that say, you know, this is the book that saved my faith. I always thought that Islam was beautiful, but I never actually saw it articulated that way. And so it's a really lovely gift gift. So if you're thinking about sending gifts for Ramadan, I would highly recommend the gift of knowledge, and if you haven't read it yourself, please do. It's really easy because you could just like put it on your bedside, flip it open, and whatever chapter opens up, you can read it that night. It's just a few pages, and it just takes you to another place. So anyway, but this book, so that was the minaret. But interestingly, so this book became the seed for two other books. This book was sort of published not in a very high quality way. Basically, you read it once and it falls apart. But the ideas are timeless and amazing. And this then actually became two books, or the seeds for two other books. One is And God Knows the Soldiers, the authoritative and authoritarian in Islamic discourses, and also Speaking in God's Name, Islamic Law, Authority, and Women. And they both deal with the whole issue of authority and how you determine what is authentic in the Islamic tradition, and the professor puts out his methodology. This little book is a gem. Not many people know about it, and it was never really marketed, but it's made its way. It's like survived and is oftentimes assigned in university classes. This book has this book in it, so it's got the complete text from this, but it's also got additional chapters, which were like afterthoughts and things that happened after this book came out, because there was a lot of controversy that came out, a lot of discussion about it, and even there's a little footnote in here that references hijab, which made a huge stink. And so he actually then develops a lot of these ideas and addresses what happened. But this book is what I would call sort of Sharia in action. It's not like The Great Theft, which I don't have here, but The Great Theft is more of a, like if you're learning Islam and trying to understand from like a textbook class, that's more appropriate for that. This book is sort of like a case study in action plus a little bit more. And it's not as difficult as some of his other writings, but I would highly, highly recommend it because I think it's just a really special book. Speaking in God's Name is the one that a lot of people find when they are trying to understand women's issues, and it's like it goes through Saudi fatwa on women, and he breaks down the methodology that the Saudis put out and critiques it, and then puts forth his own methodology as well. It's a really powerful book for anyone who is engaged in any issues regarding women, and what all of the garbage that's out there that against women. And then of course I would just have to say this is his latest book, Reasoning with God, which is kind of like the magnum opus so far. It's his, it's a lot of everything. It's personal stories, it's philosophy, it's history, it's basically a scholar's lifetime and the way his intellectual thought developed over time. It's not a really easy read. In parts it is very easy when he talks about stories, but it's like everything you ever want to know about the state of affairs in Islam for today. So anyway, there's even more, but these are some of the gems that I wanted to share. And I hope that, if you just need some quiet time with a book, that you will pick one of these. But start with, people often ask, like, where do I start? This Search for Beauty is the best place to start because it's very engaging, very interesting, based on real life stories. And it will change your view of Islam and how you know it in this world. So, or in this context in America. So I'm very excited for another halaqah. Thank you very much. And please consider adopting a surah or adopting a bookcase in the library if you can. And inshallah, thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa tabi'u bi ihsanin ila yawm ad-din. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي امري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Rami, how do I... You see these things on the side?
Just this?
No, these cuts.
Yeah.
Like, how do I get them? Oh, okay, so you reduce that?
What do you want to do?
Actually, you sort of did it. Yeah, okay, you did it. I want to see both texts at the same time.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
Okay, so inshallah today we'll do Surah Saba. I apologize for the late start. I'm physically struggling a little bit. But inshallah, we'll plunge in. So, Surah Saba is Meccan, it's a Makkiyah, Surah Makkiyah. In the tradition, there is a debate as to whether it was revealed shortly before Surah Al-Isra or whether it was among the surah that was revealed after Surah Al-Isra. So whether it is a pre-Al-Isra wal-Maraj or a post-Al-Isra wal-Maraj. Without getting into all the back and forth and I think that it is far more likely that it was revealed after the Isra wal-Maraj rather than before the Isra wal-Maraj. And in fact, I think that Surah Saba was revealed after Luqman, and probably before Surah Zumar and Surah Ghafir. We didn't do Luqman, but we did Zumar and we did Ghafir. So if so, then it would belong to the late Meccan period rather than sort of the late middle period. And the reason I think so has to do with chains of transmission. It doesn't have to do anything with the substance of the surah itself. Allahu Alam. Sometimes there's just there is no way for us to conclusively pin down a time of revelation, especially when reports about occasions of revelation, asbab al-nuzul, surrounding a particular surah, are not decisive. Okay, so it was said in my view that it is post-Isra, and it yet, like all Meccan surahs, it sets an anchor for Muslims, another building block in the aqaid al-Islamiyya, or the fundamental beliefs structure of the Islamic faith. A lot of the Meccan surah are foundational. It is upon, everything is built upon these foundations. And it is a methodological error to fail to read what comes later in light of what comes earlier. And it is among the surah that starts with Alhamdulillah, which there are 5 surah in the Quran that start with that expression, Alhamdulillah. The Al-Fatiha, although there's a debate as to whether Al-Fatiha starts with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim or Alhamdulillah. Al-An'am, there's no debate as to Al-An'am, of course. Al-Kahf and Fatir, and then Saba. And as we will see, the beginning of the surah is not coincidental. It is core to what the message of Surah Saba is. And Surah Saba, while at first appearance seems to just respond to the claims of Meccans, to do what people who don't pay careful attention, they think the Quran does all the time, and that is to respond to criticisms of those who doubted the Prophet ﷺ. It has an core ethical message, as we will see, and it communicates to us. It talks about the Prophet Dawud, alayhi salam. It talks briefly about the Prophet Sulaiman, alayhi salam. It talks about Saba, the kingdom of Saba itself, which was a Yemeni kingdom, which we'll talk a little bit about. And like we usually do, the question is, why these stories, in the context of this particular surah, in the way that these stories are said, and what is the point that we get from them? Okay. الحمد لله الذي له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وله الحمد في الآخرة وهو الحكيم الخبير. يعلم ما يلج في الأرض وما يخرج منها وما ينزل من السماء وما يعرج فيها وهو الرحيم الغفور. وقال الذين كفروا لا تأتينا الساعة قل بلى وربي لتأتينكم عالم الغيب لا يعزب عنه مثقال ذرة في السماوات ولا في الأرض ولا أصغر من ذلك ولا أكبر إلا في كتاب مبين. Okay, so it starts out with Alhamdulillah الذي له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وله الحمد في الآخرة وهو الحكيم الخبير. Alhamdulillah, to God, affirming that all of creation, whether what is in the heavens or earth, is contingent and thoroughly dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That this world, although, as we will see, it might appear to human beings that it is not already in all its details and particulars claimed by its owner, although it might appear to human beings that they are autonomous in this world, in this entire universe of creation, or that they own it, the delusion of ownership, and the delusion that ultimately they are sovereigns within this world. The Quran, time and again, affirms that in order not to go down the path of that delusion, you must understand that you are existing in something that is owned by another. And in fact, we know that in the Islamic outlook, and as we see in Surah Saba itself, that all human ownership goes through the divine will, meaning that in fact, ultimately it is God that owns. We are simply entrusted. Surah Saba is revealed after the Quran tells human beings that the trust was offered to the heavens and the earth, and that they failed to carry it, and human beings carried it. And after the revelation of that ayah, I believe in Surah Al-Zumar, time and again, the Quran emphasizes that your position in this world, or humans in the world, are trustees in what is owned by another. In fact, your bodies, your money, your wealth is all simply things that you are entrusted with, not things that you own. And as we will see, there's a reason why it starts this way. But then one of the things that you find Quranic commentaries talking about is that why does it say Alhamdulillah alladhi lahu ma fi samawati wal ard, Alhamdulillah, Allah that owns the heavens, earth, and then repeats again Wallahu alhamd وَلَا الْحَمْدُ فِي الْآخِرَةِ, and again repeats and praise to God specifically in the hereafter. And although, different commentators have suggested different things, but I believe that the right answer is that critical and core to Surah Saba is that this creation is entirely frivolous if there were no ultimate consequences to human existence. That in fact, hikmah, which again Surah Saba will underscore, wisdom itself, the principles of justice require the akhirah, require the hereafter, mandate the hereafter. And so it is the next stage of human understanding to be grateful for, in fact, the existence of the thing that they fear the most. And as we will see in Surah Saba, Surah Saba draws a picture of human beings and the extent to which they try to dilute the idea of consequences and the hereafter. That they try to water down the idea in a variety of ways. And the reason they do that, it's not because they are confident of their fate if there is a hereafter. It is the human beings that are most prone to doubting the hereafter are those who, in the truth of their soul, they are most worried about the hereafter. There are many human beings that claim that they are not worried and that they're not concerned and that they have a great relationship with Allah, or that they're fine, or that they're in good standing. But you will also find that they are the ones that will often think to themselves, is there really going to be a hereafter? Are there really going to be consequences? Is it really going to happen? And it is this state of doubt is not because they are in fact confident about their fate if there is a hereafter, but it is because within themselves their subconscious wishes that there isn't a hereafter, that there are no consequences. And so when the surah starts out with these double hamds, the second hamd specifically, and we will see how the surah itself develops, specifically for the concept of the hereafter, i.e. for the concept of justice. It is the concept that human beings have the greatest difficulty with, because strict justice, in which nothing escapes God, no privilege, no aggression, no transgression, nothing escapes God, is the boogeyman that makes human beings anxious and is the real cause for much of their stated doubt. This is why often you find those who are in fact the least worried about their fate in the hereafter are the ones that tend to doubt the least. You know, it's they're at peace with the concept of ultimate justice, because they, within their own soul, they know that they're in good standing. But that's not the case with the vast majority of human beings, as Surah Saba tells us in a second. Okay. وهو الحكيم الخبير. Hakim, the wise, and Khabir, they translated as aware. This is the study Quran, as you guys know. The hikmah is required for justice, for akhirah to warrant alhamd, if the hereafter will warrant gratitude, it requires hikmah, it requires wisdom, because the constituent foundation for justice is hikmah. But hikmah is not possible without precise knowledge. Any claimed wisdom without a foundation of precise knowledge is a mirage. And so it is quite the precision of the Quran is quite remarkable. That وَلَهُ الْحَمْدُ فِي الْآخِرَةِ وَهُوَ الْحَكِيمُ الْخَبِيرُ, in that order. And then right away, then Surah Saba gets closer to the topic, to the main point. يَعْلَمُ مَا يَلْجُ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَمَا يَخْرُجُ مِنْهَا وَمَا يَنْزِلُ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ وَمَا يَعْرُجُ فِيهَا وَهُوَ الرَّحِيمُ الْغَفُورُ. This is a God that has intimate knowledge of everything. Everything that dwells on earth, everything that is beyond earth. In Quranic commentaries, they will often point out to sort of a grammatical issue, وَمَا يَعْرُجُ فِيهَا, that I don't usually stop at points of grammar because it's not, when you're talking to non-Arabic speakers, it doesn't communicate well to them. But let me see how they translated it. Maybe He knows what enters the earth, and that which issues therefrom, that which descends from the heaven, and that which ascends here to. They just translated as ascends here to. If someone is interested in knowing the difference between يَعْرُجُ إِلَى and يَعْرُجُ فِي, ask me in the Q&A. For those who, why does Allah talks about al-uruj fi as-sama instead of al-uruj ila as-sama? But that's for now. I'm not gonna pause it. Okay. So Allah is fully aware. So you exist in a purposeful world where nothing is simply, not even the smallest thing, nothing is simply away from the sovereign sight. And all interactions between this world and everything that surrounds this world in this massive what is the word I'm looking for, that surrounds the earth,
The atmosphere.
Universe.
the massive universe that surrounds this earth, God is intimately aware of all and involved with all. وهو الرحيم الغفور, that, as this actually is something that pointed out by a number of Quranic commentators, that it takes a great deal of amount of compassion and mercy to sustain life on this earth the way it is sustained, because it requires constant interventions by the divine to keep life on this earth protected the way it is protected. And this will harken back to something that we will hear about the people of Saba. That you might, if you're tempted to think that the safety that you enjoy in your life on earth, and the violence that you see all around in the universe is a coincidence. It's not. It takes the involvement, intimate involvement of God from one moment to the other for this life to be preserved, and that it is a merciful God and constantly forgiving God, a God who does not, as we will see from the story that the stories that will be given to us in Surah Saba, is a God that doesn't carry a grievance. If this was a vengeful God, like the God of the Old Testament, who's often angry and vindictive and so on, the continuation of life would not materialize. Because in fact, the rule that God constantly has from God's creation is ingratitude. And as we will see, certain delusions. Delusions that are fundamentally inconsistent with God's sovereignty and God's ownership of this universe. Okay. وقال الذين كفروا لا تأتينا الساعة قل بلى وربي لتأتينكم عالم الغيب لا يعزب عنه مثقال ذرة في السماوات ولا في الأرض ولا أصغر من ذلك ولا أكبر إلا في كتاب مبين. So right to the core issue, which we got a sense of at the beginning of the surah. They say the hereafter will not be. That the hour will never come upon us, meaning that there is no hereafter. And they get a very decisive response, and a response in the Arabic, it's a very confident, cool, collected response, which is lost in the English translation, because Bala wa Rabbi, it's like saying, it's literally like if you tell me there is no hereafter and I sort of snicker and say, I've got news for you. No, it is coming. Bala wa Rabbi, it's that type of response. Well, no, you're just simply flatly wrong. And it's interesting that then the immediate commentary about this is you're just flat out wrong. There is a hereafter. There is accountability. what's interesting is that then Allah doesn't Allah comments on this by again affirming that there is nothing bigger or smaller than the smallest seen thing, a zarra. And the Arabs used to believe that the zarra is the smallest thing. So when the Quran said something smaller than a zarra, I mean, in our days, it doesn't surprise us that there's something smaller than a zarra. But in the Prophet's days, this caused the Arabs to sort of sneer at the Prophet and say, well, there's nothing smaller than a zarra. So how can God know something smaller than a zarra? Because there's nothing smaller than a zarra. Of course, we know now that there are things smaller than a zarra, but an interesting note. But that, as we will see, the issue in their disbelief is not an intellectual position where they have rejected a creator and a manager of the universe, but it will go back to a certain type of human delusion that we'll talk about, a certain type of egoism, which resists the idea that this world has an owner, and that owner gets to call the ethical norms for creation, and that owner gets to define what is right and what is wrong, and that owner has decreed the principle of justice, which these people fundamentally are afraid of. So, do you follow the point? Is that instead of further elaborating upon that there is hereafter, Allah simply reaffirms the point that nothing in this world is happenstance. I know you're tempted to want to believe, for a variety of reasons, as we will see, that things just happen in this world, and it's all coincidence, and that all types of things go unaccounted for or unnoticed. But that's precisely your error. I don't remember where I read this, but Ja'far Sadiq, one of his comments about Surah Saba, تجلى الحق تعالى في كلامه ولكن لا تشعرون, that Allah has already manifested in the revelation, but it's just that you fail to see that in fact, for those who say, well, we don't see Allah, or we don't experience Allah, or we don't touch Allah, well, Allah has actually fully manifested in the revealed word. It's just that you are not seeing that because of your own weaknesses and your own problems. Okay. So nothing escapes God's knowledge, and nothing is happenstance. إلا في كتاب مبين. كتاب مبين, normally it's translated in a book or something to that effect. Yeah, it's not a Quran, but it is in a clear book. إلا في كتاب مبين is not necessarily a book. إلا في كتاب مبين means, it could figuratively, metaphorically, mean according to a clear set of rules. That everything is according to laws that the sovereign has put into place in existence. Okay. وَالَّذِينَ سَعَوْا فِي آيَاتِنَا مُعَاجِزِينَ أُولَئِكَ لَهُمْ عَذَابٌ مِّن رِجْسٍ أَلِيمٍ ويرى الذين أوتوا العلم الذي أنزل إليك من ربك هو الحق ويهدي إلى صراط العزيز الحميد وقال الذين كفروا هل ندلكم على رجل ينبئكم إذا مزقتم كل ممزق أنكم لفي خلق جديد. So this is now, we are at okay, but first let's go back to 4 and 5. Accountability, the principle of accountability is affirmed in 5. وَالَّذِينَ سَعَوْا فِي آيَاتِنَا مُعَاجِزِينَ. The study Quran translates it as those who endeavor to thwart our signs. في آياتنا معاجزين, those who, how do I put it? A mu'ajiz is someone who is an obstructionist. So, how are you an obstructionist to God's signs? There is something in you that is threatened, and as we'll see, threatened because of certain delusions. But it's threatened by the sovereignty of the sovereign. And it is threatened by the very idea that you are simply a trustee, not an owner. And it is threatened by the very idea of a purposeful existence and ultimate accountability and the principle of justice. So, your reaction to this is not simply that you don't believe, but you actively want to deny that reality. And how do you actively deny that reality? Well, one is the example that the Surah Saba gives us, is where you go around calling the Prophet a liar or insane or possessed. But there could be many other forms to a mu'ajiz. A mu'ajiz could be where you mock anyone that you see, or you exude an attitude of arrogance and superiority towards believers, or you are addicted to skepticism for the sake of skepticism, which we encountered earlier, where every time you experience a point of repose or tranquility, your worst self, your dark self, immediately pulls you away from that state of repose, of tranquility, into a state of skepticism and doubt. In mu'ajiz, you could have trope questions where no matter what response, what intellectual answer you get to these trope questions, there are these same questions that you keep insisting on having unanswered. That's also mu'ajiz. And you know, the examples are many, but in mu'ajiz is not just a someone who doesn't believe, but but someone who has a denial itch. It's sort of they have inside of them. It's as if they feel it in their chest. They constantly want to die. They feel like they want to deny, and a lot of times they don't understand why they want to deny, but they want to deny. And every time, even when they meet someone that could start drawing closer to tranquility and peace, to iman, they ruin that friendship. They ruin the relationship. And they run to the person who will affirm their anxieties. If they find themselves in any type of social situation, they go to a mosque and they pray Jama'ah in the mosque, and they feel something because the voice of the Imam reaches their heart. The next thing they know, they're making excuses not to go pray behind that same Imam again. It's a prototype of a human being. In mu'ajiz, long time ago, I knew a friend who attended a halaqa, Sheikh Sha'rawi, who's a Quran commentator on the Quran. And Sheikh Sha'rawi had a very charismatic personality in a way that attracted a lot of people. And I could see that this guy was sitting during the halaqah and he was smiling and he was really into it. The minute we left the mosque, I could see the anxiety form on his face. He was in there smiling, and I could tell he was at peace. He was impressed by what he was hearing. But we stepped outside the mosque, and I could see the anxiety. And I knew, the minute I said, "How was it?" I knew what his response was going to be. "Well, I don't know, I'm confused." Predicted, absolutely. The addiction, because the illness in the heart is a serious illness. And he's not possessed, he can help himself, but that denial comes from a weakness that he doesn't want to confront. Okay. أولئك لهم عذاب من رجس أليم. Rijs, let's see how this is 5. They just said painful punishment of torment. Min rijs alim is painful. Rijs is something that is heavy, so it's a heavy punishment, heavy painful punishment. And rijs is when you, in this context, is when you deserve something. You've earned your state of uncleanliness. You've earned the impurity of your condition. So in Sufi-esque tafsirs, Azabun min rijsin alim, in Sufi-esque tafsirs, they often say that for this person, the worst punishment is that they get to see the true ugliness of their soul without filters in the hereafter. And when they see the amount of arrogance, the amount of ingratitude, the amount to which they are committed to a egocentric existence, it's horrifying. It's like being dirty without any hope of ever being clean. And 6 is affirming something that the Quran often affirms. We're not going to pause at it long, that it is the people of knowledge, real knowledge, who are most often the one who can understand the wisdom of the revelation. And then we start in 7 getting an example of those who are mu'ajizeen, those who are obstructionists. And it starts out with something that sounds like mockery, because they are saying, shall we tell you about a man who says something very odd? You won't believe what this man says. What does this man say? This man says that after our bodies have completely become scattered, the water evaporates, we dry up, we end up in the stomach of, or I don't know, in whatever these things that ate human bodies, the little insects, the millions and millions of them, leave alone any scavenging animals that might scavenge a body, leave alone, the whole disintegration. The water that evaporates from human bodies, God knows how it recirculates. Human body disintegrates into dust, into ashes, whatever. It again is circulates back again into existence, but fundamentally nothing remains of this human body. And this man is saying that after human body reaches that state, somehow we are coming back again. Now, of course, the man that they're referring to is Muhammad ﷺ. But why are they saying, shall we tell you about a man? They're mocking the Prophet. They're making fun of him. And it's like saying, shall we tell you about a guy who's saying really crazy stuff? It's the same thing. Indeed, this man is either a liar or he is outright possessed by jinn. And that's why he's saying these crazy things. And in verse 9, أَفَلَمْ يَرَوْا إِلَى مَا بَيْنَ أَيْدِيهِمْ وَمَا خَلْفَهُمْ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ وَالْأَرْضِ إِنْ نَشَأْ نخسف بهم الأرض أو نسقط عليهم كسفا من السماء إن في ذلك لآية لكل عبد منيب. Verse 9 on the one hand is the threat that if Allah would have wanted, there would be no Rahim and there would be no Ghafoor, and life wouldn't continue to exist. If Allah would have wanted, you wouldn't exist. And that's an obvious point. Don't they see that as they mock this man, that in fact we could bring very easily an end to their entire existence? But the point that deserves a bit of a pause is that fascinating Quranic expression, أَفَلَمْ يَرَوْا إِلَى مَا بَيْنَ أَيْدِيهِمْ وَمَا خَلْفَهُمْ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Don't they see what is that which is before them and what that is which is before them and that which is behind them? No. What is between their hands, before them and behind them, in the heavens and earth. It's one thing to say, don't they see the heavens and earth before them and behind them? But when you say what is between their hands, before them and behind them, in the heavens and earth, it only begs the question of, well, what is between their hands, before them and behind them, in the heavens and earth? It's like saying, don't they look to the reality that is right there at their fingertips, in the heavens and earth, all surrounding them? And of course the literalists, they didn't pause at this very long. The people who paused at this were the Sufi-esque tafsirs. And the more Sufi the tafsir, the longer the pause. I think it's very fair to say that. Because it begs the question about what is the nature of reality that is right there at your fingertips and between your hands. If I make a fist in space, am I actually holding emptiness? Or am I holding something? One of the most interesting comments I've read about this, because it was written centuries ago, and I couldn't find, if you guys figure out where I read this, let me know. Commentator said, if you have two cylindrical spheres, spheres that go around, and as long as you can pass something between them, it means there is no, it's not empty space. So as long as you can pass anything, regardless of how, even if it's extremely thin. So there, it uses this to say that, in fact, every time you are not holding a void, you're actually holding. Of course, this is before we know that there are atoms and stuff like that. But it's saying that there's always substance. It's just that we don't see it. We sometimes can experience its effect. We can do experiments to realize its existence, to demonstrate its existence, but we don't know its true nature. And it's, again, this is centuries before we are aware of atoms and all of that. And he's saying, how could it be that creation can be so full of things, even when to the eyes it appears like empty space, but in fact it's never empty space, if there isn't a creator? I mean, again, something written like 600 years ago. In my notes, I wrote, this was written 600 years ago, but I didn't write who I was reading. Go figure. To my great frustration. It's fascinating. Now, in Sufi-esque tafsirs, they say this, that in fact the only thing between your hands, right before you and behind you, in the heavens and in the earth, that as you go through the steps of irtiqa, you eventually realize that the only thing that is truly between your hands is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the only real existence. And that in fact, Allah occupies all the space around you. Wherever there is, Allah is not, wherever Allah is absent in space, there is darkness and deterioration. And there is the demonic. That's typical Sufi-esque. But wherever Allah is, there is life and existence. And in our language, energy. Of course, they didn't say energy. But there is power, as they say, there is quwwah. Okay. Then, after 9, the surah starts taking us to the main central point, because it starts telling us about Dawud, and it will tell us about Sulaiman, and then it will tell us about Saba. And with Dawud, what it chooses to tell us is something that we've been exposed to already, that Dawud was given, that nature supplicated with Dawud, and we already saw that in a previous tafsir. But here, it takes us from a different angle. So, وَقَدْ أَتَيْنَا دَاوُودَ مِنَّا فَضْلًا يَا جِبَالُ أَوِّبِي مَعَهُ وَالطَّيْرِ. Okay, so the mountains are going to supplicate, they're going to resonate with the supplications of Dawud. And so will the tayr, everything that flies. Dawud is completely in touch with nature. One of the most interesting things, again, I read about the supplications of the mountains, is Dawud reportedly had a very beautiful voice. And it said that the mountains, when Dawud would sing, Allah gave him a voice where the mountains would echo with the singing. But while normal human voice, the echo is incomplete or quickly fades away, the echoing of the mountains with Dawood's supplications or Dawood's voice was supernal. It's interesting that in some mountainous areas, the echo that you hear is actually not weak at all. I'm not saying that echo was the supplications of the mountains, but the relations between echo, and in fact, one of the sources says that the echoes that we hear in mountainous areas are sort of a leftover from the powers of Dawood, but that's just, there's just a speculation. But Dawood's voice and supplications are thoroughly in touch with nature, and nature responds to these supplications in perfect harmony. Now, this is a very different image of Dawood in the Quran. The image you get of Dawood in the Quran of David is very different than the Bible. And same with Solomon. Both in David and Solomon in the Bible are sort of brutes. Solomon, in fact, is sort of not really a believer in God. He worships, he's a mushrik. He worships idols. He marries 200 women. He has 500 concubines. The image of Solomon and Dawood in the Bible as pious human beings with beatific powers is something quite unique to the Quran itself. But this is not just it. Dawood was given in his, not just an intimate relationship with nature and a realization of the truth of existence, that all of this existence is fully cognizant of the sovereign. It's like, again, to just bring it closer to one's mind, when you read, Eastern wisdom, and they tell you that, all the Eastern religions become fully aware that everything is living, from the soil to the trees to the grass to the leaves and that everything has an energy, and it's the same basic idea. But Dawood is able to communicate in a way that fully resonates and interacts with all living things. Okay. But then we are told of something else. وَأَلَنَّا لَهُ الْحَدِيدِ أَنِ اعْمِلْ سَابِغَاتٍ وَقَدِّرْ فِي السِّرْدِ وَاعْمَلُوا صَالِحًا إِنِّي بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ بَصِيرٌ. What is it talking about here? Well, وَأَلَنَّا لَهُ الْحَدِيدِ, in classical sources it tells you that Dawood was given the power to shape iron. That he would touch iron and it would mold to his will. I don't believe that that's what Dawud had. What Dawud had, in my humble opinion, he was given the knowledge, the technology of ironworks. And his big technological advancement was the ability to build war shields that were not too light as to be worthless protection and not too heavy so that it becomes an obstruction to fighters. Dawud was able technologically to use iron to build shields that were sturdy but light enough for battle. And that technological know-how made all the difference. For, remember, we go from Musa, and we've already been to the technological advancements of Dawud, and then the technological advancements of Sulaiman, his son. But contrary to the Bible, where Dawud basically is a warmonger, in the Quran, that technological advancement is used to do good. وَعَمَلُوا صَالِحًا. Okay, so there's a leap in the technological advancement. And subhanAllah, centuries later, we are going to divide periods in human history. You guys still remember the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age? It's very interesting that what it underscores is ironwork as a major advancement. But next we come to Sulaiman. And Sulaiman's description is fascinating. وَسُلَيْمَانَ الرِّيحَ غُدُوُّهَا شَهْرٌ وَرِوَاحُهَا شَهْرٌ وَأَسَلْنَا لَهُ عَيْنَ الْقِطْرِ وَمِنَ الْجِنِّ مَنْ يَعْمَلُ بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ بِإِذْنِ رَبِّهِ وَمَنْ يَزِغْ مِنْهُمْ عَنْ أَمْرِنَا نُذِقْهُ مِنْ عَذَابِ السَّعِيرِ يعملون له ما يشاء من محاريب وتماثيل وجفان كالجواب وقدور راسيات اعملوا آل داود شكرا وقليل من عباد الشكور. Okay, well, this is 13. So, just take note, making of him whatsoever he willed, places of worship, statues, basins like reservoirs and cauldrons, firmly anchored, work, family of the wooden thankfulness, though few of my servants are thankful. So what is Sulaiman given, or we're told about what Sulaiman is given here? This very fascinating reference or allusion to Sulaiman using wind to travel. And the study Quran says molten copper, which is the nihas, the ability to, the technological know-how to use another metal as strong as iron but lighter. But in the case of Sulaiman, we also know the special relationship with jinn, and that jinn in some reports, although none of it we can say is, we can rely on its authenticity, that the jinn even built the temple on the mount for Sulaiman. Other reports are just we know from our earlier tafsir that Sulaiman is also has the technological know-how to use glass in buildings. We saw that with Queen of Sheba already, if you remember. So it is another leap in human ability. The only thing I want to say about this jinn issue with Sulaiman is it's quite remarkable. I don't know if you guys ever watched that series Ancient Aliens on the History Channel. A lot of the puzzling things that shows like Ancient Aliens raise would be easily resolved if the jinn are the aliens. And their involvement in human life until Sulaiman alayhi salam, I think, is actually an absolute reality in a lot of different ways. But of course, we don't know. We don't have a lot of archaeological evidence about Sulaiman himself, but we do have archaeological evidence of civilizations that existed around this time, and there are a lot of very puzzling things about these civilizations. Okay. The jinn believe, especially the jinn that Sulaiman forces into labor for him, and believe that there's a long established tradition in Islamic sources that before human beings, jinn existed on earth, and that among the rebellion of shaitan is that they believed that they were the rightful inheritors of earth, but Allah put human beings on earth, and that these jinn that ultimately ended up serving Sulaiman believed that they own the earth, and that they are far more intelligent than human beings, and that they are far more technologically advanced and technologically able than human beings. And that as a result, it is absurd that God would ask jinn to share earth with human beings, because human beings are clearly not as intelligent, or that's at least what these jinn thought, and they simply do not know how to do the things that jinn are capable of doing. But there was a further mythology that the jinn insisted on, a parable of delusion, if you will, that the Quran presents us with. And that is, they know what human beings do not know. They know al-ghaib, the hidden. And so, when Allah gives Sulaiman the ability to subjugate some jinn the rebellious jinn, to his service, some choose to disobey. And we don't know, other than Allah telling us that they will receive their due in the hereafter, we don't know what happens to them. There are a report that there was, but it's not a reliable report, that those who chose to disobey were zapped in some form of fire or something. But anyway, we don't need to posit that report. But their haughty and arrogant attitude of superiority was firmly adhered to, because they firmly believe that if it hadn't been for the fact that God forced them into Sulaiman's service, there is nothing that human beings there's nothing that they can possibly escape their knowledge. And there comes the story that I'm sure all of you have heard of. You've heard of the Sulaiman's cane? That he realizes that death is near, and he sits in a position on his throne, kneeling on a cane, on a asa. And as long as the jinn believed he was alive, they continued to do the work that Sulaiman had ordered them to do. But as his cane was eaten away by what is that thing that eats woods?
Termites.
Termites. That eventually the cane is weakened enough until it breaks, and he falls. And once he falls, the jinn realize that he's dead. And once they realize he's dead, there comes a critical moment. Some of them say, our arrogance, we now realize that we arrogantly thought we knew everything. But if in fact we knew everything, how did we not know that this man is dead for an entire year? And that humbling experience brings him back to God. While others were resentful and became sworn allies to shaitan, sworn to derail human beings. But what is the delusion engaged in here? Is the delusion of a power that is independent from God, and an ownership of the world that is apart from what God says you own. And now, whether you choose to believe this as a parable or as an actual historical event is not the issue. But the issue is to reflect upon, if you are in the place of this jinn, when you saw the termites eat the stick and this symbol of power falls, would you have realized your egoism, and that in fact all claims of ownership are devoid unless God says so? So that's one. So this takes us to 14. Then immediately it moves on to the second narrative. And the narrative of Saba is more, which one is more philosophically challenging depends on how deep of a thinker you are. But the one about Saba is closer to human experience. And so it might communicate. So what is the issue about Saba? Saba is a civilization in Yemen that their technology was not ironwork and it was not molten copper. Their technology is water. Now, a point to reflect on. We are accustomed to think that there's a technology, if Sulaiman is given knowledge of ironwork, that's different than if Sheba is given knowledge of waterwork. But what if it's not? What if all technological advancement is in fact an inspiration from Allah? How many scientific discoveries have taken place by so-called coincidence or accident? The vast majority, right? The big leaps. And in fact, as we will see, the Quran tells us more directly that all ilm progresses because Allah wills it to progress. And there is no happenstance, there is no coincidence. So Saba, the people of Saba, have developed this technology about water, and they are able to build dams and a complex set of irrigation waterworks that was very advanced for their time. And because they're able to do that, although their civilization starts out something like 500 years before Christ, it continues for about 1,000 years. And by some estimates, clearly over 1,000 years, some even say 1,300 years, 1,400 years. So we're talking about a long expanse of time. And they don't only build a very strong civilization in Yemen, but their empire at one point expands to include parts of Abyssinia, to even go up the coast of Arabia, to even include parts of Sham, parts of Palestine and Syria. The ability to regulate water is a huge technological advancement and leads to a very powerful civilization and a very wealthy civilization. In fact, it's ironic now when you see the state of Yemen, but in the old days, the Yemen used to be called Al-Yemen Al-Sa'id, the happy Yemen. The reason it was called the happy Yemen is because it was supposed to be a paradigm of wealth and riches. It was a commercial center and where people got rich and trade and commerce thrived. And in fact, they had developed the writing system, and the record-keeping system was more advanced than civilizations of the area at their time. So even their mathematics and their accounting and we've learned more about their judicial system, their legal systems, all of this about 500 years or so before the Prophet ﷺ. Oh, okay. Some of you haven't prayed Asr? Okay. So before we take the break, just picture a very wealthy and rich Yemen that lives very happy with all the money. And before you break, key to that wealth is that their commercial lines, their trade lines, are safe and secure. They managed to develop a system that protected their trade lines, their commercial lines, from highway robbers. So it's actually a good policing system. Highway robbers and pirates are always the bane of trade. And it involved little risk of loss because there were enough resting stops along the commercial trade lines so that you are traveling a short distance and stopping for rest and provisions, and you are changing your animals, you're changing your guards, you're renting new camels, new horses, whatever. So ultimately, the percentage of your commodities that you end up losing in transit is a very small percentage. And that means a lot of wealth in concrete terms. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break and pray us. Okay. So, the critical thing was the story of Saba is in the Quranic reference in verse 20, when they say, Lord, increase the distance of our journeys. And this is a good example of where you need a good amount of research to find the context of to understand what the Quranic reference is, because the people receiving the revelation, they had a context, and it referred to something that they understood that is not as accessible to us. So what is the critical issue? Is, as we said, is that they had a dam, they had a good irrigation system, and they had travel routes that were secure and that lent themselves to the lucrative trade which they enjoyed. The main change came when there was a desire to make that trade less egalitarian, less accessible, and more subject or more amenable to monopoly by the powerful families or the main centers of power in Saba. And so started a interesting process by which there was ambition to extend the trade routes aggressively. So that was one. Second, to extinguish the various settlements along the established trade routes that made it possible for less wealthy, less powerful families to compete in the economic system that they had. So basically, trading would become expensive, and you would need far more capital or greater capital to be able to trade, because the the rest houses or the rest stops that used to exist along the way, one by one, were extinguished. And the way they extinguished them, I mean, you get a lot of different reports. Some even said that the some of the wealthy families hired private armies and terrorized the settlements along the route of trade to get them to leave. There are reports of massacres that took place. There are reports of basically threats where they were told, you either leave or we're going to massacre you or we're going to attack you. But the point is that the richer families or the more wealthy families wanted to monopolize the trade and make the trade that you would need more capital to be able to compete. And so all these sort of not very wealthy families would be squeezed out of the market. And that did happen. And for a while, these families were making insane profits because only those that could afford, for instance, to buy the most expensive camels, the camels that can travel the longest distances without having to change camels every X amount of kilometers, were the families that could stay in competition. The families that couldn't do that were squeezed out of the business. And that meant a greater concentration of wealth in Saba. But Saba, remember, Saba is a civilization that lives for for well over 1,000 years. And so there's an enormous amount of arrogance about their power. Not just in Yemen, but they extended their power into Abyssinia. They had colonies in Abyssinia. They had colonies all along the Gulf of what is now the Saudi Arabia. They had colonies even in Palestine and in Sham. And the idea that anything that could, if people were being forced into poverty, too bad. The rich families that were making a killing had been on the top of the food chain now for long periods of times, and this was a situation that they were very happy with. And the couple of interesting things is that the Quran comments on this by saying, وَلَقَدْ صَدَّقَ عَلَيْهِمْ إِبْلِيسُ ظَنُّهُ فَاتَّبَعُوهُ إِلَّا فَرِيقًا مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. That Satan, they turned out to be what Satan thought of them. So it's like saying, exactly very similar to what we have with Pharaoh, when Pharaoh thinks little of his people, so they obey him. Satan sort of thinks, I can get these people to go off the rails. And they, in fact, ended up not disappointing Satan and doing what Shaitan wanted them to do. It looked like simply commercial decisions, but it led to clear social results in the monopolization of wealth and greater social inequity within Saba. And then comes the calamity that the Quran describes as مَزَّقْنَاهُمْ كُلَّ مُمَزَّقٍ. مَزَّقْنَاهُمْ كُلَّ مُمَزَّقٍ. Let's see how they translate it. So we tore them completely to pieces. But the key here is the calamity starts with the crumbling of the dam, the Saba, the dam of Saba. So the dam itself crumbles, and that's the beginning of the disasters. After that, the civilization of Saba is beset by a series of natural disasters. And when the Quran says, "Mazzaqnahum kulla mamazzaq," they were torn to pieces, but that process of being torn to pieces took about 200 years. The deterioration of Saba from the height of civilization into the mess that they became wasn't an immediate process. And there is a very interesting footnote to the story of Saba. If in Yemen there are locations, especially where the ruins of a lot of the Saba ruins are, that are purported to be among the most haunted. I mean, if you want a jinn experience, Yemen is a very good place to have a jinn experience, especially in these areas. I'll circle back to this because there's a point to it. Okay. So the delusion of Saba is the height of power, and that they are free to enjoy or to manipulate the wealth that they had as they saw fit. God is, we know from the history of Saba that they've worshipped different things at different times. They've sometimes were idol worshippers, sometimes they worship the sun, sometimes they worship the moon. Eventually we have the story of the Queen of Sheba, then Sulaiman. Monotheism seems to be introduced into Saba, and then they move from monotheism to, especially during the period of their deterioration, into a whole hodgepodge of religious beliefs that are all over the place. And they start breaking apart, and civil wars start breaking out as the resources, and especially water, becomes more scarce, plants fail, and as the Quran says, the Quranic expression is rather fascinating. That God says that their gardens, their once very bountiful gardens that existed on both left and right, are replaced what is it? Yeah. If you look at 16, so when they turned away, we sent the flood of Aram upon them, exchanged their 2 gardens for 2 gardens bearing bitter fruit, tamarisks, and lot trees. So the significance of this is that it is consistent with the gradual deterioration in agricultural quality in Saba. It wasn't an overnight thing, but what they were able to grow what they were once able to grow, they were no longer able to grow. and suddenly the soil that they used was not producing what they were accustomed to and what their wealth was built on. Okay, so that's the story of Saba that we're given. And then Surah Saba, from there, moves on to talk specifically about the Prophet ﷺ and those that the Prophet ﷺ engages. And there are two central points. If you look at 23, what it underscores, وَلَا تَنْفَعُ شَفَاعَةُ عِنْدَهُ إِلَّا لِمَنْ أَذِنَ لَهُ حَتَّى إِذَا فُزِعَ عَنْ قُلُوبِهِمْ قَالَ مَاذَا قَالَ رَبُّكُمْ قَالُوا الْحَقَّ وَهُوَ الْعَلِيُّ الْعَظِيمُ. This is 23. And no intercession will work with God except those that God gives God allows to intercede, such that when the terror is banished from their heart, they will ask, "What did your Lord say?" They will reply, "The truth." And God exalted is the great. فُزِعَ عَنْ قُلُوبِهِمْ. The terror is banished from their heart. What is it talking about? What terror that is banished from their heart? And whose heart will have terror banished so that they will be asked, "What did your Lord say?" And they will reply, "The truth." Then that tell them that you have your deeds and we have our deeds. We're not responsible for your deeds. You're not responsible for our deeds. And Muhammad, we've sent you to all humanity. Until we get to 32, or 31, sorry, where those who are at the end, موقوفون عند ربهم يرجع بعضهم إلى بعض القول يقول الذين استضعفوا للذين استكبروا لولا أنتم لكنا مؤمنين. So in 31, it takes us to an image of a confrontation between those who were subjugated, or those who were powerful, and those who were subjugated, and they blame each other for their situation and their condition in the hereafter. The weaker party will tell the stronger party, "Well, if it hadn't been for you, we would not have been led astray." While the weaker party replies to the stronger party replies to the weaker party and says, "This is nonsense. You, in fact, you were mujrimeen, you were criminals." Okay, so hold on to these 2 points. Terror banished from the heart, and this argument between the so-called stronger party and weaker party blaming each other. So we can resolve that tension after Maghrib, inshallah. Before we pick up where we left off, if we go back to the story of Saba, when they say ربنا باعد بين أسفارنا, some in some sources they even say that just so going back to this whole, like, what that phrase meant, longer God extend our travel, or that, so some sort of say that أرادوا أن يتطاولوا على الفقراء بالركوب على الرواحل, that just gives you a sense that the rich people, or the wealthier in society, wanted to make trade less accessible and more difficult. Although that particular report that travel, that it used to be that the trade could be conducted on foot, but that the rich classes wanted to extend the routes of trade so that you wouldn't be able to trade without animals, is not among the is not very reliable. But because I found many reports that basically it's not, the issue was not the use of animals, but what type of animals, the class of animals. That the longer trader routes required far more expensive animals that the rich, the poorer classes could not afford. And note that in verse 16, when it says فَأَعْرَضُوا فَأَرْسَلْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ سَيْلَ الْعَرِمِ, this is before it says وَبَدَّلْنَاهُمْ بِجَنَّتَيْهِمْ جَنَّتَيْن, that we've made their gardens grow afoul. It says this expression فَأَرْسَلْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ سَيْلَ الْعَرِمِ. This is normally translated something like torrents or something like that. So in the study Quran it says we sent the flood of Aram. In inscriptions, we actually found a reference in archaeological inscriptions to a flood that is referred to as the flood of Aram. But Aram could also, in the Sabatain language, mean just simply the land. And one of a better interpretation that I prefer, Sayl al-Aram could refer to what is known as Sayl al-Khawatir wal-Waswas, meaning that it's not just that their crops started going wrong, but their hearts became full of anxiety. And that state of stability and order that they enjoyed started to evaporate. So that, and this is consistent with the fact that they eventually descended into civil wars. They became paranoid, they blamed each other for their problems, they fought over resources, and of course when rich people start funding wars against each other, and basically paying private armies to wage war against one another, it's the end of civilization from there. Okay, so let's go back to where we left off. حتى إذا فزع عن قلوبهم, and that image that we get in Surah Saba, where the mustad'afin and the mustakbirin, the more powerful is the weaker is blaming the powerful for their fate, and the powerful is telling the weaker that you're to blame. You are yourselves. بل كنتم مجرمين أنحن صددناكم عن الهدى. You want to say that we are the ones that prevented you from guidance? بل كنتم مجرمين. No, you are criminals. Now, بل مكر الليل والنهار إذ تأمروننا أن نكفر بالله ونجعل له أندادا وأصروا الندامة لما رأوا العذاب وجعلنا الأغلال في أعناق الذين كفروا هل يجزون إلا ما كانوا يعملون. So 33, it says بل مكر الليل والنهار. Okay, no, it is in fact the cunnings. Makr al-layl wal-nahar, it's like the cunning, the massive cunning. But it doesn't telling us who is cunning, who's doing the cunning, and who's tricking whom. It just says, it comments about this entire situation with this expression. I should look at that. What is it? 33. Plotting by night and day is the way the study Quran translates it. And then all parties are punished. And then 34 comments that indeed it is always في كل قال مترفوها إِنَّا بِمَا أُرْسِلْتُمْ بِهِ كَافِرُونَ. It is indeed always a situation that the most well-off classes that are first to reject. But think of back to the story of Sulaiman and the jinn. The jinn were subjugated because they believed Sulaiman was alive, but in fact Sulaiman was dead for a period of time. And Saba, their civilization continued for a long time until various parties became greedier and greedier and found numerous elements in society that was willing to support their plans, quote unquote, for expansion and development. It wasn't couched as let's monopolize wealth. It was couched as expansion and development. in fact, the richer classes coerced the poorer classes into disbelief, then we know that God's justice wouldn't punish the poorer classes if they were indeed coerced. So, what is the message here? Well, if you go back to حتى إذا فزع عن قلوبهم قالوا ماذا قال ربكم. In some interpretations tells you that this is verse 23, that here it's the angels who, the angels are in the hereafter, they want to intercede, but then they get scared off interceding and say they don't intercede. Well, that's nonsense. That doesn't make any sense. It's not talking about angels. Angels are not the ones who are going to be asked, "What did your God say?" And they say, "Oh, God said the truth." Well, the angels don't need to be terrified to say God says the truth. فُزِعَ عَنْ قُلُوبِهِمْ, it's the fear of God rids people of their delusions. Why is it that the weaker still deserve punishment? It's because it is the delusions of both that made this process work. The delusions of the rich, that they're entitled, and the delusions of the weak that defer to the delusions of the rich and empower their sense of entitlement. Put differently, sometimes oppression requires two culpable parties: the oppressor and the submission of the oppressed. Sometimes it is your own delusions, which is the same, very close to the idea of the Pharaoh and the people that follow the Pharaoh. فَاسْتَخَفَّ قَوْمَهُ فَأَطَاعُوهُ. Those who follow the Pharaoh are not defiant towards the Pharaoh, because in fact they empowered his sense of grandiose and his sense of entitlement, and ultimately empowered all his injustice by believing themselves subservient to the Pharaoh. And how many times do you hear people who are dominated and controlled say, well, the only way that we can be led is by a tyrant? So many people who live under tyrannical systems firmly will say, but you know, this is the way we are as a people. We need a tyrant. We need a strong man. We need a despot. They are culpable in their own subjugation, because there are delusions of grandeur and there are delusions of subservience. Now, as we will see, when it comes to human beings, and I'll show you in a second, Saba starts out by telling us about the delusions of jinn. Very confident to deluded. The delusions of Saba. Then the delusions of people who will start blaming each other for having gone wrong. But within a single human being, you will simultaneously suffer from both types of delusions at different parts, different stages. Sometimes you will shoot yourself in the foot because you think you are far greater than you are. And sometimes you'll shoot yourself in the foot because you don't give yourself its worth or its due. Sometimes you think you are far more entitled to than what you are entitled to, because you've lost sight that, in fact, you are just a delegate in God's world. And other times, you let go of your rational faculties and your moral compass because you follow a mirage, a dream, a plan, a fantasy. Now, and we are presented with what, for any student of the Quran knows, it's a rather obvious delusion. Those who say, well, we're wealthy, we have a lot of children, this is in 35. We have a lot of children and we're wealthy, and believing that this brings them closer to Allah, the obvious point that it doesn't. But وَالَّذِينَ يَسْعُونَ فِي آيَاتِنَا مُعَاجِزِينَ أُولَئِكَ فِي الْعَذَابِ مُحْضَرُونَ. This is 38. I just want to see again how they just translated this time. And those who, they just, okay. We've talked about the expression mu'ajizin, right? Okay. قل إن ربي يبسط الرزق لمن يشاء من عباده ويقدر له وما أنفقتم من شيء فهو يخلفه وهو خير الرازقين. That whatever you spend, you are in fact spending on something that God has made you a trustee with, entrusted with, your wealth. And I'll share with you something in a second about this. And then another form of delusion. Those who actually thought they're praying, and this is a double bizarre layer delusion. They thought they're worshiping angels, and it turns out that in the hereafter they weren't actually worshiping angels, but they were worshiping jinn instead. This is 41. How does that happen? Jinn did interact with them. The reason they turn out to have been worshipping jinn is that because of the interactions, they experience what we call paranormal activity. And because they experienced paranormal activity, they thought, well, we're dealing with angels. And then it turns out that, again, the layers of delusion, that they weren't dealing with angels, they were actually dealing with jinn, and that, well, they shouldn't be worshipping jinn or angels, but they thought they were worshipping angels, and in fact, what they were interacting with is jinn. Okay. as to the issue of spending, it's a long hadith, but maybe I'll find a way. The Prophet ﷺ comments on the ayah in 39. There are different versions where we're told that different companions are the ones asking, but so the one that is most famous is the one where Zubair is the one interacting with the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, I'll read it in Arabic and then I'll paraphrase in English because it's a little bit long. It says, قال الله عبادي أنتم خلقي وأنا ربكم أرزاقكم بيدي فلا تتعبوا فيما تكلفت لكم به فلا تتعبوا فيما تكلفت لكم به فاطلبوا مني أرزاقكم وإلي فارفعوا حوائجكم انصبوا إلي أنفسكم أصب عليكم أرزاقكم أتدرون ما قال ربكم قال الله تبارك وتعالى يا ابن آدم أنفق عليك أوسع عليك ولا تضيق فأضيق عليك ولا تخزن فأخزن عليك إن باب الرزق مفتوح لا يغلق ليلا ولا نهارا ينظر الله منه الرزق على كل بقدر نيته وعطيته وصدقته ونفقته من أكثر عليه ومن أقل أقل عليه ومن أمسك عليه يا ذبير فكل وطعم ولا تقصي فيحصى عليك ولا تقتر فيقتر عليك ولا تعسر فيعسر عليك إن الله يحب الإنفاق ويبغض الإقتار وإن السخاء من اليقين والبخل من الشك فلا يدخل الدار من أيقن ولا يدخل الجنة من شك يا زبير إن الله يحب السخاوة ولو بفلق تمرة. And it goes on. So what he's saying is the Prophet ﷺ is commenting to, in this version, to Zubair, who was one of the prominent companions of the Prophet ﷺ. And he's telling him, in a nutshell, there is no way that you have real Iman unless you are willing to spend in Allah's way. And importantly, it is a very anti-stinginess hadith among the many traditions, because the circulation of wealth, the reason that men can't own gold in Islam is because we want wealth to circulate. Hoarding of wealth destroys economies and oppresses people. We want money to work. But more importantly, we want wealth to be shared. And what the Prophet ﷺ is telling Zubair in this hadith is that among the delusions that human beings rely on is the delusion that this wealth is theirs and they're entitled to hold on to what they earn. And in fact, as we know, it's emphasized in the Prophet's Sunnah itself, والسلام, but also in numerous hadiths, that what is in your hand could be intended for someone else, but it was placed in your hand simply, you as a medium, to get that thing to someone else. And the responsibility in the hereafter of Allah saying, you know, when I allowed you to make X amount of money, yes, God, well, I intended this money for these 10 people, and you didn't give the money to these 10 people. Well, they asked me, but I didn't think I could afford it. Well, you know, guess what? You were wrong. That was your delusion. Because if you would have spent it, I would have given you X, Y, and Z. Or, you saved it because you wanted to feel more safe and secure. Well, I've afflicted you with constant anxiety and lack of ability to sleep, constant restlessness, constant unhappiness, precisely because you held on to what you're not entitled to. So, then comes to the ayah that's the dhikr for this entire surah and the key, which will surprises a lot of people, or at least should. قل إنما أعظكم بواحدة أن تقوموا لله مثنى وفرادى ثم تتفكروا وما بصاحبكم من جنة إن هو إلا نذير لكم بين يدي عذاب شديد. قل إنما أعظكم بواحدة. I will give you one advice. أن تقوموا لله مثنى وفرادى ثم تتفكروا. What an interesting advice. First, break away in twos, and then break away in ones. And think, seriously think about your affairs. This prophet is clearly not possessed. And for the Meccans, they also knew that this prophet is not a liar. And that what he is promising you, that there is accountability. Now, why break into twos and into ones? Why mathna wa furada? Saba is talking about a particular type of delusions that only introspection and honesty with self can expose. The delusions that of power and subservience that grow from your interaction or ill interaction with wrong social contexts. You are part of a class, you are part of a profession, you are part of a guild, you are part of a trade, you are part of whatever part of your the clique that defined you. In the same way that you are part of the jinn, or you are part of the Qawm of Saba, or the part of Saba was broken into several major clans which united to form the civilization of Saba, and then these clans obviously then broke apart. But that first break away from the social norm. the social norm that feeds these delusions. And first, isolation is hard. So first, be mathna, in twos. But then graduate from the twos into one, furada. And have real transparency and ask yourself, look at 48, 49. قل إن ربي يقذف بالحق علام الغيوب. Allah يقذف بالحق, literally like, let's see what the Holy Quran's 48. Does cast the truth? No, it's not cast the truth. It's like the Allah that shocks you with the truth, smacks you in the face with the truth. It just gets that your attention was boom. And then يقذف بالحق. Now, وما يبدئ الباطل وما يعيد. If you are truly honest and you think about, nothing makes sense in terms of your existence without what the surah began with, accountability. Because if you just exist and you do or whatever you do, and there is no accountability, there is no justice, and then the jinn dominating humans, makes sense, fair game. Humans dominating jinns if they can, fair game. The rich dominating the poor if they can, fair game. The poor rebelling and murdering the rich if they can, fair game. Everything is fair game. The only thing that doesn't make it fair game is accountability and the inevitability of justice. And that's what وَمَا يُبْدِئُ الْبَاطِلُ وَمَا يُعِيدُ. Falsehood gets you nowhere. It deludes you. It tricks you. It makes you think you've got something. You're on a high for a while. But like the jinn, like the people of Saba, like the people who are blaming each other, it all crumbles. وقالوا آمنا به وأنى لهم التناوش من مكان بعيد وقد كفروا به من قبل ويقذفون بالغيب من مكان بعيد وحيل بينهم وبين ما يشتهون كما فعل بأشياعهم من قبل إنهم كانوا في شك مريب. Now look at how the surah ends to underline the theme of delusion that I was talking to you about. So at the end, Say, if I have gone astray, I have only gone astray to my own loss. And if I'm rightly guided, it is through that which my Lord reveals unto me. Truly, God is hearing near. God is near. Could see when they are terrified and there is no escape, and they are seized from a place near at hand. وقالوا آمنا به وأن لهم التناوش من مكان بعيد. وأن لهم التناوش من مكان بعيد. The Arabic, it's like the feeling of it's like your delusions have left you in a place where anything can seize you, can come and grab you. And it is, do you know when people who, I don't know if any of you have had that experience, but if people who have a near-death experience and they say, we felt complete and utter despair. This perfectly describes that. It's like that point where there is nowhere to go, no escape, and you feel you are at the mercy of something terrifying coming and just grabbing you. "53, and they will say, when they had disbelieved, and when they had disbelieved in it beforehand while impugning the unseen from a place far away, ويقذفون بالغيب من مكان بعيد. They disbelieved in it while standing. It's يقذفون بالغيب is like من مكان بعيد. They were speculating, speaking nonsense. Like you're standing there at the shore and you're just speculating a bunch of nonsense about stuff you don't know. وحيل بينهم وبين ما يشتهون كما فعل بأشياعهم من قبل إنهم كانوا في شك مريب. And what is the ultimate conclusion? The reason for the delusions is exactly a shahwa, the desire, what they covet, what a human being exists coveting, desiring, wanting. But when all is said and done, these desires have led them astray where they've reached nothing. So let's wrap up Surah Saba. One of the, in Ibn Ajiba, where is it? Ibn Ajiba has a little passage. Ibn Ajiba says, he has like a parable that he's talking about. He says that when Shaitan looks at a human being and he sees that human beings are mujawwafa. Mujawwaf is hollow. Human being as if hollow. And Ibn Ajiba say that, you know, when human beings are hollow, they fill up this hollowness, this hollow self, with a bunch of egoism, arrogance, delusions, fictions about the self, fictions both for the self and against the self, fictions of what I can do that are often exaggerations, or what I cannot do that are often also exaggerations. Megalomania and insecurity simultaneously. And that Shaitan looks at this hollowness and says, this is my playfield. Because so Shaitan basically says, well, you know, this hollowness, I can run around in it. And then Ibn Ajiba said, وَمَنْ لَا يَصُدُّ الْمَجَارِيهِ, that unless you block this hollowness with dhikrullah, Shaitan will run amok in it. Shaitan will take your little moments of megalomania and exaggerate them into entitlements to no end. And will take your little moments of lack of confidence and will exaggerate them into deep insecurities to no end. Shaitan will make you a bunch of contradictions so you can't get along with people. And so that you're constantly clashing, not just with people, but even with yourself. You restless to the, and Ibn Ajib pictures this, it says, dhikrullah, it's coming in and filling the hollowness with the only meaningful thing, and that's divinity. The only thing that scares Shaitan away. And then Shaitan says, okay, well, I can't mess around with this. He means it as a parable. You know, it's not a literal thing, but it's a very useful way of understanding what Surah Saba is delivering. But Surah Saba, now go back to the time, if it's true, and this is after Al-Isra, the Muslims that apostated. And the Muslim that will remain with the Prophet ﷺ are the Muslims who are going to have a great amount of humility and amicability to get along with the Muslims of Medina. Muslims of Mecca migrate to Medina. Do you know if but for the grace of Allah, the migrants of Mecca could have ended up fighting with the Ansar of Medina? You have people, these are tribal societies. So you have people that are coming completely broke. They left everything back in Mecca. And they're living as guests in the homes of the Ansar. Well, you know, guests after the third day start becoming annoying. Right? They have their own habits. They like to eat at their own time. You know, they don't pick up after themselves. They leave the towels wherever. I don't know, whatever it is. Why didn't the Ansar and the Muhajirun end up fighting with each other? Is because of the way the Quran raised these people. The way it cleansed their egoism, disciplined them, and said, look deeply within before these major steps are to unfold. Because we're going to build a civilization and learn from the experience of those in the past. One final note. You know, we talked about Surah Al-Jinn, and I kept thinking, there is something in the surah about, we know that eventually, at different times, the civilization of Saba worships paranormal deities. They even engage in sacrifices, but this is towards the deterioration periods. And the end of the surah, when it warns about those who worship, and the fact that we were covering Saba right after Surah Al-Jinn, among the things that human beings, the delusions that human beings engage in, is to think that they, and the more I thought about it, is the delusion that all there is material existence, and there are no supernatural powers that are constantly at work with who you are as a human being. And that is a delusion. Materiality, 5% of existence, as your entire universe, is just stupid. We live in 5%. And to exist in your life as if that's 5% is the beginning and the end is just idiotic. And the wise person protects themselves from alam al-shahada and alam al-ghayb, the world of the seen and unseen. And as far as I know, unless I'm forgetting something, this is Surah Saba. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.